Okay, everybody, this is Chapter 2 of The Americans, the Revolution and the Early Republic. Open up your textbook to page 44 and follow along while I lead you through some of the bigger ideas that we'll see in this chapter. Here on this page, you'll see primarily this big painting showing the Sons of Liberty pulling down a statue of George III on the Bowling Green in New York, July 9th, 1776. You'll see along this timeline the Boston Tea Party, the First Continental Congress, and the Intolerable Acts, the Second Continental Congress. Look, there's the Liberty Bell. We all recognize that. And then, of course, over here, George Washington. You can see where he becomes president. So really, the revolution's in a very short amount of time. Now, at the beginning of every chapter, you should pay close attention to the issues and topics of that are going to be discussed. Here is a very important question. How much power should the national government have? That's a big question because while we do see the ratification of the Constitution right here, it's not the first government of the United States. What we're going to see in this chapter is that we actually had a government from the end of the Revolution up until 1788, 1789, and then we started a second government. So we tried one experiment in government and it failed, and then we replaced it with the form of government we have today, the Constitution. Other questions we'll talk about: which should have more power, states or the national government? That's a very important deal in our society even today, and there's a lot of debate about that even now. So that's why we point these out. We study history so that we can learn from it and apply it to today. Also, how can the new nation avoid a return to tyranny? Tyrannies like that dictatorship under the King of England, and whether or not we want to enjoy the freedoms, preserve the freedoms that we fought for, or are we just going to elect another king? The rights of all people be protected. Notice all people, not just the white, wealthy men, but also women, minorities, Native Americans. How can we protect all of the people in this new government? So these are some of the bigger questions. All right, if you turn the page, you'll see that Chapter 1, Section 1 is entitled Colonial Resistance and Rebellion. The main idea here is that conflicts between Great Britain and American colonies escalated until the colonists finally declared their independence. So we need to find out why the escalation of violence and conflict occurred and try to evaluate it. Was it any big conflict, or was it kind of a small conflict? Now, the chapter begins, very interestingly enough, by talking about the story of Crispus Attucks, who died at the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre is, as you learned in middle school, a significant part of the story of the American Revolution. It's actually one of the first examples of violence that's taken up against the king. And any violence against authority is important when understanding the root causes of a revolution. Now, notice that the organization to resist England begins early on here, and it doesn't begin with Crispus Attucks. That comes later. It begins with the Sugar Act and King George III. Now, in this section, you'll learn about why King George needed to tax sugar, and it's pretty much because of debt. Now, debt, as you know, is a big deal today. Our country is in massive debt, and so we can learn a lot about the dangers of government debt and what it can lead to. Now, over here on this page, you'll see what the Sugar Act did. There are three things, and you need to know what three things the Sugar Act was. The Stamp Act is the next section right here. The Sugar Act leads to the Stamp Act. Right? So what we're going to see here is a series of actions by the king to try and raise money to pay for the debts that the war against the French caused. Remember the French and Indian War? Well, it caused a lot of debt. And the Stamp Act is one of the responses to. And this is the really important part of understanding the causes of the American Revolution. Right here, you'll see the action and reaction of each of the acts that lead up to the revolution. The Stamp Act, why did the British do it? The reaction of the colonists. This right here is the Townshend Acts, the action and reaction. Boston Massacre, action, reaction. T Act, action, reaction. Intolerable Act, action, reaction. Lexington and Concord, action, reaction. Now, as historians, that's important because we learn from history. And what causes a revolution in 1776 could cause a revolution today. An interesting example of vandalism. Today it might be called terrorism. I want you to pay close attention to the idea that Indians is in quotes here. Why would the Patriots, these proud sons of liberty, why would they disguise themselves as Indians if they're so proud of what they're trying to do? Then we get the Intolerable Acts. Well, that was, of course, the name that the colonists gave to these acts. And these acts shut down Boston Harbor. So what we start with the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act lead to more and more severe actions by the Lexington and Concord. Now, this painting was done many years after the Revolution was over. And it shows our brave Minutemen in a little more organized fashion than they truly were. There really wasn't a lineup of men wearing the same colored uniforms shooting at a lineup of redcoats. What we see in Lexington and Concord is more chaos than was what is shown in this picture. All right, it's pretty much a bunch of men standing around angry at a bunch of soldiers and shooting. The Second Continental Congress and the Battle of Bunker Hill are described here. Interestingly enough, the Battle of Bunker Hill didn't actually happen on Bunker Hill. It happened in a different place. And it really wasn't a victory. It was actually a defeat for the Americans. This is a theme in American history. Whether or not the United States wins a battle, whether or not the Americans are victorious, isn't really that important in our history. Kind of weird, huh? What's really important is that the battle happened in the first place. We lost the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British took control of the hill. At the end of the day, they were on top of the hill and we were not. Now, also in this section, you'll see the olive branch petition discussed. And that's an interesting little piece of American history because it shows that the American Revolution wasn't unanimous. It wasn't that everyone in the country wanted this revolution. This was a revolution by a very small number of people. And while there were small numbers of people fighting against the British, most of the Americans didn't want to be American. Now, revolution itself is an idea that comes from a guy by the name of John Locke. The idea that as an individual citizen, you have the right to rebel against your government if your government violates your rights. John Locke is one of the English philosophers of the Enlightenment who comes up with this idea that government is essentially an agreement between two groups, an individual and a society. And they have this agreement called the social contract. And it's right here. It says, an agreement in which the people consent to choose and obey a government so long as it safeguards their natural rights. The King of England violated this contract, and therefore they had the right to start their own government. Now, down here, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. We're going to be looking at this. This is a great document. And Thomas Paine is very much like a hot-headed propagandist. Over here on this page, you'll see Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which draws upon the ideas of Locke's natural rights. All right, we get the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's interesting that Jefferson says the pursuit of happiness, because what John Locke said was life, liberty, and property. Once again, I need to point out that down here, this is where the vocabulary is. All of the bolded words you need to know, and you should make vocabulary cards or vocabulary lists. On this next page, this is actually the Declaration itself. And what's interesting is that this page not only shows you one of the most important documents in human history, it also shows you how you can take notes when reading a primary source document. Make notes in the margins of what each section says. Over here you'll see there's more, right? Now, pay attention, because while the document itself says that all men are created equal, essentially what it means is guys like this, wealthy, white, wig-wearing landowners are equal in society. but nobody else. And that's a big deal. Now, in this section here, we see a really important discussion. This is, of course, Abigail Adams, wife of the second president of the United States, John Adams. And while John was at the Continental Congress creating this new government, she says to him, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not push unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." So that's interesting, is that the Enlightenment generation that founded our country was very aware of the dangers of replacing one king with another. Okay, section 2.2, chapter 2.2, the War for Independence. Over here, you'll see these are part of the colonies where many of the battles were fought. Saratoga is one of the most important battles of the war. And over here, you'll see a little picture of the most famous American, George Washington. And this section, I have to say, is kind of a propaganda section, because it really talks about how everyone just loved Washington so much that they fought bravely for him and that he suffered along with his men. Historically speaking, it's somewhat true, but there's a lot of propaganda in that section. By even today's standards, he was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He was worth over $500 million by today's standards, making him one of the wealthiest men in the colonies. He had over 300 slaves on a 5,000-acre farm in Virginia, making him one of the biggest farmers in one of the biggest colonies in the Americas. He had a lot at stake here. He did lead by example, and he did fight alongside his men. Very few presidents can say that they actually led their own men into battle and faced death, and he did. Saratoga, because unlike Lexington and Concord or the Battle of Bunker Hill, this one actually was an American victory. And it was such an important victory that the French noticed. And without the help of the French government, the American Revolution would have failed. Now, Lord Cornwallis is here. That's the British general who surrenders at the Battle of Yorktown. And the Battle of Yorktown is another significant battle in the American Revolution. It is the place where the British finally surrendered and went home. So, Saratoga, Bunker Hill, Lexington, Concord, Yorktown. All of these battles are important to know and remember why they're important. At the end of the American Revolution, the British signed the Treaty of Paris, and this confirms that the United States is independent and a new country. Now, the war then kind of takes an interesting tack, because with the Declaration of Independence saying all men are created equal, well, a lot of men wanted to be equal. And here you can see the whole question of slavery becomes important. In this new society, are we going to have equality or egalitarianism, which is the belief in the equality of all people? Are we going to have egalitarianism for the slaves and for the women and for Native Americans? And the answer is no. So what we see in this American Revolution is many themes that will be repeated throughout revolutions across the world. They start with high hopes and high principles. They're led by charismatic leaders who ultimately keep the power for themselves and betray the principles upon which the revolution Chapter 2.2 ends with another vocabulary section. Make sure that you add this to your growing list of vocabulary cards and know what each one means. This is about it for this first half of Chapter 2. There'll be another video covering the second half of Chapter 2 right after this. So make notes. Make sure you read and take notes as you go through. And hopefully this video has helped you understand some of the broader strokes and bigger ideas of the chapter so far.